My mother's funeral was on a Tuesday in November, the kind of morning where the sky stays the color of old concrete from the moment you wake up until the moment the day finally gives up on itself. There were 47 people at the service. I counted them the way I count things when I am trying to keep myself steady, which is a habit I have carried since I was a child and have never fully outgrown. 47 people, most of them from her church. Some from the neighborhood where she had lived for 31 years. A few from the quilting circle she had joined after she retired from teaching. My brother Garrett was in the front pew with his wife and their 2 daughters. I sat beside him. We did not speak during the service except to pass each other the folded program. My mother's name was Nancy Jean Marsh. She was 69 years old. She had taught 3rd grade at Jefferson Elementary in Evanston for 26 years. She had made excellent pie and mediocre coffee, and had kept her garden with a devotion that bordered on religious. She had been sick for 14 months. Lung cancer, diagnosed just after her 68th birthday during what was supposed to be a routine checkup. She had handled the illness with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to everything, asking careful questions at each appointment, noting her medications in a small spiral notebook she kept on her nightstand, declining to dramatize any of it. I admired this about her. I also found it, at times, profoundly lonely, because it meant the end of her life unfolded the way much of her life had unfolded. In a register too private for any of us to fully enter. My name is Lauren Marsh. I am 38 years old. I am an architect. I live in Evanston, 12 minutes from the house where I grew up, which is either convenient or insufficiently adventurous depending on who you ask. I have never been entirely sure which I believe myself. What I do know is that Evanston is where my work is, where my friends are, where the particular texture of the streets and the light off the lake in the early morning feels like home in a way that no place I traveled to during the years I spent working for firms in other cities ever quite managed to replicate. So I stayed. I put down roots in the same soil where I was planted, which I have been told is something some people envy and others find provincial. I have learned not to care too much about which category I am being assigned to on any given day. After the service there was a reception at my mother's church. Coffee and sandwiches in the basement fellowship hall. I stood near the back and accepted the condolences of people I barely knew, saying thank you, and yes, she was remarkable. And you are very kind in a loop that lasted about an hour and a half. Garrett circulated separately from me, as he had been doing for most of my adult life whenever we were in the same room for a social purpose. Meaning we occupied the same space with practiced mutual competence and almost no direct engagement. We had never been close. I had told myself for years that this was simply who we were. 2 people who happened to share parents and a childhood address, and very little else that created natural intimacy. It was the explanation I had always found acceptable. It was also, I now know, incomplete. I was standing near the coat rack pulling on my jacket to leave when a woman I did not recognize touched my arm. She was perhaps 70, small and slightly stooped, with white hair cut short and a gray wool coat. Her eyes were a pale, attentive blue, the kind that makes you feel you are being read rather than seen. She had been at the service, I thought, though I could not have placed her in any specific seat. She introduced herself as Helen. She had been a friend of my mother's for many years, she said, from before either of us was very old, though they had lost touch for a time and only found each other again about 6 years ago. She said she was very sorry for my loss. She spoke carefully, the way people speak when they have chosen their words in advance. Then she opened her purse and took out an envelope. She said my mother had asked her to give this to me in the event that she was not able to say it herself. She said my mother had been very clear about who the envelope was for and about the timing. She pressed it into my hand. The envelope was sealed. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting, which I recognized instantly the way you recognize certain things immediately without any deliberation because the recognition happens somewhere that precedes thought. I asked Helen if she knew what was inside. She said she did. She had known for 6 years. She said my mother had carried this for a very long time, and she hoped I would be gentle with her for that, and she hoped I would understand that the love was never in question. Then she said goodbye and walked past me toward the door. And by the time I had processed that the conversation had ended, she was already gone. I stood there in the church basement with the envelope in my hand for what must have been several minutes. Garrett had already left. The women from the church were collecting sandwich trays and folding tablecloths. The overhead lights in fellowship halls have a particular quality, too bright and slightly yellow, the kind of light that makes everything look like an interrogation. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket and walked to my car and sat in the parking lot and looked at a windshield for a while. I did not open it until I was home. I live in a 1940s brick bungalow on a street of similar houses 2 blocks from the metro station. I bought it 5 years ago when I was finally making enough that a mortgage felt like a reasonable risk rather than an aspiration. It is not large, but it has a lot of windows, and the bones are good, and I have spent the past 5 years slowly making it mine. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table with my coat still on, and opened the envelope with the handle of a butter knife because I did not want to tear it more than necessary. Inside was a letter, my mother's handwriting, 4 pages in her careful script, the same handwriting that had written my name on lunch bags and birthday cards, and the margins of the books she pressed on me during childhood with the confidence of someone who believed books were the most reliable form of care. I am going to tell you what was in that letter, not because I owe anyone the private contents of a correspondence between myself and my dying mother, but because the letter is where the real story begins, and nothing that came after makes any sense without it. And I think, having lived through the 2 years that followed the morning I sat at my kitchen table in my coat and read those 4 pages, that some things need to be said out loud. Not to accuse anyone, not to ask for any particular judgment, just because the truth of a life should not have to stay folded up in a sealed envelope in someone else's purse. It deserves more room than that. My mother wrote that she had loved me completely and without reservation for 38 years. She wrote that she was sorry she was not able to say in person what she was about to say on paper, and that she had tried more than once to find the words during the past 14 months and had never been able to locate the right moment or the right version of herself from which to say them. She wrote that she was afraid, not of dying or not primarily of dying, afraid that if she said nothing, I would spend the rest of my life not knowing something I had the right to know, and she found, at the end, that that possibility was more frightening to her than any other. She wrote that Robert Marsh was not my biological father. I read that sentence 4 times. Then, I set the letter down on the table and looked at the wall above the kitchen window, which is painted a soft white I have always liked, and I waited for whatever was going to happen in me next. My father, Robert Kenneth Marsh, he had died 11 years earlier, a heart attack at 61, the kind of sudden end that the doctors said they saw more often than you would think, and that the rest of us never see coming no matter how many times the doctors say that. He had been a quiet man, an engineer who designed drainage systems for municipal projects, someone who communicated primarily through steadiness and showed affection through reliability rather than expression. He had coached my soccer team for 2 seasons when I was 9. He had taught me to drive in the parking lot of the mall on Sunday mornings when the stores were closed. He had come to my architecture school graduation and stood very straight in a way that I understood meant he was proud, even though he did not say so directly because he rarely said anything directly. I had loved him. I still loved him, in the way you continue loving the dead, which is a love that asks nothing of them and is therefore very clean. My mother wrote that she had met a man named James Calloway in the winter of my parents' 2nd year of marriage. She had met him at a neighborhood gathering, an informal block party that January in honor of the Bears making the Super Bowl that year. She and Robert had been married for 18 months, and the marriage was already quieter than she had imagined it would be. Not bad, not unkind, just quieter than the marriage in her imagination, which she understood to be her own failure of imagination as much as anything else. James Calloway was a civil engineer who had recently moved to Evanston from Columbus. He was warm and talkative, and very interested in the things she was interested in, including teaching and books, and the question of what made a neighborhood a real community, rather than simply a collection of adjacent houses. They became friends first. She wanted me to know that. They became friends first, and then they became more than friends, for about 5 months in the spring and summer of that year, and then my mother ended it because she was married, and because she did not want to be a person who destroyed her marriage, and because she could see that the situation was becoming something neither of them could manage cleanly. She and James Calloway did not speak again after that summer. He moved away from Evanston the following year. She did not know where. When she discovered she was pregnant with me, she did the arithmetic. She told me she was certain, or as certain as a woman can be in such a circumstance, that I was James Calloway's child. She chose not to tell Robert. She chose to believe, or to try to believe, that it did not matter, that the child would be loved and raised and would belong to the family they were already building, and that the biological question was a private accounting no one else needed to see. She made this choice, she wrote, with her eyes open and her hands shaking, and she had lived with it every day of her life since. She did not ask me to forgive her. She said she did not think it was hers to ask. She said only that she hoped I would know that her love was never a performance and never a compensation. It was just love. It had always been just love. The last thing she wrote was this. She said she knew where James Calloway was. He still lived in the Chicago area, had moved back some years ago. She had not been in contact with him, but she had found him some years earlier when she first began to think about what she needed to do, and she had his address, and she included it on the last page of the letter. She said the rest was up to me entirely and always would be. She said she had faith in me. She signed it, "Your mother always." I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The light outside shifted. Whatever remained of the November afternoon narrowed down to a thin line of gray along the rooftops visible from my kitchen window. And then it was gone entirely, and I was sitting in the dark. I did not turn the lights on for a while. I just sat there with the 4 pages in my hands, reading them over and then folding them and then unfolding them again, letting the information rearrange everything and then watching to see what shape things took when they settled. Here is what I understood by the time I finally stood up and turned on the kitchen light. The man I had called my father for 38 years was not my biological father. There was a man in Chicago, whose name and address were printed in my mother's careful handwriting on the last page of a letter she had written to be read after her death, who was my brother, or the person I had called my brother for 38 years, was my half-brother at best, which meant the already insufficient thread that connected us had just become even thinner than I had known. And my mother, who was 2 days dead, and whose absence was already a specific physical weight in my chest, had known all of this for 38 years and had not said a word. I called Patricia Voss the next morning. Patricia was an attorney I had been referred to some years earlier when I was buying my house and had needed legal advice on a title issue. We had stayed in occasional contact since, the kind of low-maintenance professional relationship where you think of each other once or twice a year when something tangential comes up. She specialized in estate law. I called her office, was told she was unavailable, and left a message saying it was not urgent but that I needed to make an appointment when she had time. She called back within the hour. I told her briefly what the letter contained. There was a pause on her end that I appreciated because it was not filled with reassurance. Patricia was not a reassurer. She was a listener and a thinker and a person who, when faced with complex information, went quiet first and spoke second. She said, "Come in Thursday morning." I said I would be there. Between the phone call and Thursday, I did not tell anyone about the letter. Not Rachel, my closest friend from architecture school, who called twice during those days to check on me and whom I told only that I was managing. Not my 2 colleagues at the firm where I worked, Morrison and Webb, who sent a sympathy card and a meal delivery credit, and otherwise gave me the space that people who work with you and like you understand to give when something large has happened. Not Garrett. I had no idea what I was going to say to Garrett or when, or whether the letter changed anything between us in any way that could be named before I had a clearer understanding of what I was standing inside. Patricia's office was in Wilmette, on a side street off Green Bay Road, a converted house with modest furniture and bookshelves that covered most of every wall. She was 55, trim, with short gray hair and reading glasses. She wore on a chain and was always either putting on or taking off. She had the manner of someone who had spent 3 decades being the person in the room, who understood things clearly when everyone else was still in the fog, and had made peace with the fact that this was their job and not a source of personal credit. I gave her the letter to read. She read it twice, slowly, setting it down between reads. Then she asked me several questions, mostly practical ones. Did I know whether my mother had left a will? I said yes. I knew she had a will. That Garrett had mentioned it to me some years ago when my mother first got sick. Did I know who the executor was? I said I believed it was Garrett. Did I have any reason to believe the will had been recently updated? I said I did not know. Patricia folded her hands and looked at me the way she looked at things she was taking seriously. She said the letter itself had no immediate legal consequence in terms of my identity or my rights. What it might have significant consequence for was the estate. depending on what was in the will and when it had last been revised. She said she would need to see the will, and that the first step was getting a copy, which as a potential beneficiary I had the right to request through the probate court once proceedings were initiated. She said she would make inquiries. 3 days after my meeting with Patricia, I had lunch with Garrett. We had agreed before the funeral to have lunch the week after, to discuss the estate. This was Garrett's suggestion. Practical as always, the kind of suggestion that is also a mild assertion of control. Garrett was 41, 3 years older than me, a sales director at a medical device company in Lake Forest. He had been organized and confident since childhood in a way I had always admired and occasionally found oppressive. He arrived at the restaurant exactly on time, ordered efficiently, and opened the conversation about the estate with the fluency of someone who had been thinking about it for longer than 3 days. He said our mother's will was straightforward. The house and its contents went to him as executor, to be sold, with the proceeds divided between the two of us equally. The modest savings account, her car, and her personal effects followed the same division. He said he had spoken with the attorney who had drawn up the will, a man named Marcus Dell, who had confirmed everything was in order. He said the process should take about 4 months if nothing was complicated. I listened to all of this. Then I said, "Garrett, I need to ask you something." He looked at me with the careful attention of someone who has spent many years managing what their face shows. I asked him if he knew anything about the circumstances of my birth. I phrased it exactly that way. The circumstances of my birth. I watched his face while I said it. Something crossed his expression that was not quite surprise. It was a more prepared movement than surprise. The kind of shift in expression that happens when a person encounters something they have been anticipating and has already decided what to do with it. He said he did not know what I meant. I told him about the letter. I told him what my mother had written. I watched him while I told him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he was sorry I had received that letter, and that it must have been a shock, and that he did not know anything about it. He said it with the smooth confidence of someone who had said rehearsed things before and knew how to make them sound unrehearsed. But the first expression, the one that was not quite surprise, sat in my memory very clearly. I did not challenge him. I said thank you for the information about the estate and paid my share of the bill and drove to Patricia's office. I told Patricia about Garrett's expression. She listened carefully, she said. In estate disputes, the timing of documents is often the most important thing. Then she told me that Marcus Dell had filed the will for probate 2 days after my mother's death. It was an unusually quick filing. Standard practice was to wait a reasonable period. She said she would obtain a copy. She obtained it within the week. The will that Marcus Dell had filed was dated 11 months ago, shortly after my mother's first round of major treatment. Patricia reviewed it and called me. She said the language was unusual. The division I had described, equal split between me and Garrett, was not what the filed document reflected. According to the document Marcus Dell had filed, the estate was to pass to Garrett in its entirety, with a note that provisions for Lauren would be handled separately through a letter of instruction already in Garrett's possession. No letter of instruction had been produced. Patricia's voice, when she told me this, was the same measured, careful voice she always used, but there was something beneath the surface of it that I had not heard before. She said, "Lauren, I need you to understand that I cannot tell you with certainty what happened here. What I can tell you is that the document as filed does not match what you have described. And I would like to have a forensic document examiner review the original." I said, "Do whatever you need to do." Here is what the examiner found. The will had been signed by my mother genuinely, in her own hand, and witnessed by 2 women from her church, whose signatures were also genuine. Dorothy Chu and Frances Kowalski, both of whom Patricia tracked down and spoke with separately. Both remembered signing the will. Both placed the signing in early spring of that year, which was consistent with a date well before the version Marcus Dell had filed. Neither remembered the language of the document they had signed in detail, as witnesses are rarely given the full document to read, only the signature page. But both were clear about the approximate timing. The document Marcus Dell had filed was dated 11 months ago. Both witnesses independently placed the signing in early spring, which was approximately 14 months ago, a 3-month discrepancy. Not conclusive, but the examiner also noted, in her written report, that the ink on the date line of the filed document showed characteristics slightly inconsistent with the ink in the body of the document. She was careful in her language. She did not say the date had been altered, she said the ink characteristics merited additional examination. I want to tell you something about the weeks between that phone call from Patricia and the eventual resolution of the legal process. Because there is a version of this story that skips past those weeks in the interest of getting to the outcome, and I do not think that version is entirely honest. Those weeks were not a procedural interlude. They were a sustained experience of a particular kind of disorientation, the kind that comes not from grief alone, though the grief was present and real, but from the specific experience of discovering that a structure you have lived inside and depended upon was built on ground you did not understand. My mother was dead. My father, or the man I had called my father, had been dead for 11 years. My brother, or the person I had called my brother, was sitting somewhere across the city with documents and attorneys, and a version of events that I could not fully see, and there was a man named James Calloway in Chicago who did not know I existed, whose address was written in my dead mother's handwriting on the last page of a letter that had been kept in a sealed envelope in a stranger. Purse the James Calloway question was the one I carried most carefully. I did not contact him during those first weeks. I thought about it. I picked up my phone on at least 3 separate evenings and opened the notes application where I had typed his address and held the phone in my hand for several minutes, and then put it down. This was not avoidance, or not only avoidance. It was the recognition that whatever contact I initiated would be irreversible. You could not call a man and tell him you believed you were his biological child, and then put that back in the envelope if the conversation went in a direction you did not anticipate, and I was not ready to be unable to undo it. Not yet. Not while everything else was still in motion. What I did instead was research. I am an architect by profession and by temperament, which means I am someone who understands existing conditions before designing anything. I found James Calloway on the professional directory of a civil engineering firm in Skokie. His profile included a photograph, a biography noting his 40 years in municipal infrastructure work, and a list of projects that included several I recognized: drainage improvements in Evanston itself, infrastructure work on streets I drove every week. He was 67 years old. He was married to a woman named Sandra Calloway. He had 2 adult children, a son and a daughter. He was in every visible way a man living a complete and settled life that had no obvious awareness of me anywhere in it. I looked at his photograph for a long time. He had gray hair, close cut. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, and he was not smiling in the photograph in the way that most professional headshots request. He was simply looking at the camera with a steady, direct attention that I recognized not from memory but from a different kind of recognition. I had a mirror in my house that showed me a version of that quality every morning. The steadiness, the inclination to look at something directly rather than slightly to the side of it. My mother had never looked like that. My father, Robert Marsh, had been slight and somewhat bespectacled, and had a way of standing as though he was always slightly apologizing for taking up space. I had always understood that I did not physically resemble either of my parents in any particularly clear way, and I had filed that fact away in the category of things that happened in genetics without ceremony or explanation. Now the file reorganized itself without my asking it to. Patricia called me in late January to tell me that the opposing attorney, Marcus Dell, had responded to her request for further documentation, with a letter asserting the will was valid, and urging that the estate process proceed without delay. He cited my mother's diagnosed condition and the timing of the document, arguing that the will had been drawn during a period of clear mental capacity well before any terminal decline. He did not address the ink discrepancy. He did not produce the letter of instruction. Patricia filed a formal contest. The hearing was scheduled for early March, 12 weeks away. In the meantime, Patricia had found something else. My mother had maintained a small investment account, separate from her primary savings, that had never appeared in any of the estate documents Marcus Dell had filed. The account was at a different institution and held a balance of $41,000. It was a payable on death account, meaning it passed directly to the named beneficiary outside of the probate process entirely. The named beneficiary was me. This was the first moment I understood that my mother had been thinking carefully about what she was doing. The payable on death designation could not be contested through the will. Marcus Dell's document had no reach over it. Whatever had happened with the primary will, whether the date had been altered or the language revised or some other interference had occurred, my mother had constructed a secondary line of inheritance that bypassed all of it. She had not trusted the primary document to reach me. She had built a second route. I stood in Patricia S. office when she told me this, and I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, "She knew." Patricia looked at me and said, "It appears she may have been concerned about the integrity of the primary document." I said, "She knew and she built around it." Patricia said, "Yes, that is what it appears. I do not know when my mother figured out that the will she had signed was not going to be the will that was filed. I do not know what she saw, or what Garrett said or did not say, or what conversation between them preceded the quiet Thursday morning when she went to a second institution and designated me as beneficiary on a $41,000 account and said nothing to anyone. I have imagined that morning many times. I imagine her sitting in the branch office in her good coat, the navy one she wore to church, watching the bank employee process the paperwork. I imagine the particular quality of her silence in that moment, which would have been the silence of a woman who had made a decision and was not going to revisit it. I contacted James Calloway in early February. I sent a letter, handwritten, to his office address. I said my name. I told him that my mother had recently passed away and that she had left me a letter that contained information about my birth. I said I had reason to believe he might have known my mother many years ago. I said I understood this letter might come as a significant surprise and that I had no specific expectation of any response, but that I had felt it was right to reach out rather than not to. I included my phone number and my email address. I sealed the envelope and walked it to the post office myself, and then went home and sat with what I had done. He called 8 days later, on a Thursday evening at 6:17. I knew the number was him before I answered because I had looked up the area code, which was the same as his office. I let it ring twice and then answered. He said, "Is this Lauren Marsh?" I said, "Yes," he said. "This is James Calloway." And then there was a silence that was not awkward so much as necessary, the kind that arises when two people are standing at the edge of something large and both need a moment to understand where they are. He said, "I read your letter 3 times. I said, "So did I." He had a deep, measured voice, the voice of someone who spent his career in meetings and site visits and professional settings, where clarity was the primary currency. He said he had known a Nancy Jennings in Evanston many years ago. In the winter and spring of 1987, Nancy Jennings had become Nancy Marsh. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had not known there was a child. He said he wanted me to understand that. He said he had not known. I believed him. I do not entirely know why I believed him so immediately, except that the quality of his voice when he said it was the quality of someone encountering a fact for the first time, not managing a fact they had already been carrying. He was genuinely surprised. The surprise was real, and it was large, and underneath it I could hear something that took me a moment to identify, because it was not a sound I was prepared for. It was something like grief, for the years he had not known. For the person I was who had been somewhere in the world for 38 years without him knowing I was there. We talked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know the exact length because I checked my phone afterward. We talked about my mother, and about what she had been like in those months he had known her, and some of what he said matched the woman I knew, and some of it was a younger version of her I had never had access to. Warm and curious and occasionally overwhelmed by the gap between what her life looked like and what she had hoped it might become. We talked about my work, and he asked intelligent questions about architecture and infrastructure that came from his own professional life and its points of contact with mine. We talked about his family. He told me about Sandra, who was a librarian and whom he had been married to for 31 years. He told me about his son Michael and his daughter Kate, both of them in their 20s, both of them in fields I might have predicted. Michael in urban planning, Kate in environmental science. He said he had not told Sandra about the letter yet. He said he needed to do that. I said I understood. Before we hung up, he said, "Lauren, I want you to know that I am not going to disappear from this if you do not want me to. I am not going to pretend this conversation did not happen." He said he understood if I needed time. He said he would wait. I said thank you. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time and looked at the address on the last page of my mother's letter, which I had set on the table while we talked. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the small wooden box where I keep documents that matter. The probate hearing was in early March. Marcus Dell presented his case for the validity of the filed will, relying primarily on the argument that my mother had been of sound mind when the document was created, and that the timing, though earlier than standard filing, was not irregular. Patricia presented the witness testimony, the ink analysis, and the absence of the letter of instruction Marcus Dell had asserted existed. She also entered into the record the payable on death account, noting that my mother's decision to create a direct inheritance pathway outside the will was consistent with a person who had reason to believe the primary document might not reach its intended recipient. The judge was a woman named Christine Lattimore. She was deliberate and unhurried, and she asked Marcus Dell twice to produce the letter of instruction. He could not produce it. She asked him to explain the ink discrepancy. His expert witness offered an alternative interpretation involving different pen pressure and storage conditions. Judge Lattimore listened carefully. She did not appear to find this persuasive. She did not rule from the bench that day. She took the matter under advisement. The ruling came 3 weeks later. She found that the evidence was insufficient to overturn the will on the basis of forgery, because the forensic finding was not definitive enough to meet that standard. But she also found that the absence of the letter of instruction, which Marcus Dell had cited as the mechanism by which I would receive my inheritance, constituted a material deficiency in the estate plan as presented. She ordered a mediated settlement process with both parties to negotiate a distribution arrangement within 60 days. Patricia called me when the ruling came through. She said, "This is a good outcome. Not a complete victory, but a good outcome." She said Marcus Dell and Garrett would now be negotiating from a position of documented uncertainty, which was a position that tended to produce reasonable settlements if handled correctly. The mediation took 3 sessions over 6 weeks. I will not walk through every hour of it. What I will tell you is that Garrett sat across the table from me in a conference room in a building on Michigan Avenue with the controlled composure of a man who had decided in advance what he was and was not willing to concede, and that I sat across from him with the particular clarity that comes from having spent 4 months looking directly at something, instead of away from it. We did not speak to each other directly. Our attorneys spoke, numbers moved, positions shifted. On the 3rd day, in the late afternoon, an agreement was reached. The estate would be divided 60% to me, 40% to Garrett, reflecting the original language I had described to Patricia as my mother's stated intention, and the court's concern about the integrity of the filed document. The $41,000 payable on death account was not part of the negotiation. It had already come to me directly when we were done. Garrett stood and straightened his jacket. He looked at me across the conference table for a moment, and his expression was not what I expected it to be. I had expected something defensive or cold. What I saw instead was something that looked, surprisingly, like exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has held a position for a long time and has been watching it become increasingly untenable and is now, finally, done holding it. He said my name, just my name, nothing after it. And then he left. I did not see him again for 4 months. The house sold in June. My mother's garden was at its summer peak when the sale closed. The roses she had planted along the back fence blooming in the particular dark pink she had always chosen, and the garden beds she had tended with such attention looking. From the driveway, like evidence of someone who had believed deeply in the future usefulness of what she planted. The new owners were a young couple with a small dog, and they had stood in the garden during the showing with the expressions of people who did not yet know what they were inheriting. I hope they learned. With the estate settled and the legal process closed, my life narrowed back down to its actual dimensions. My work at Morrison & Webb, which had continued throughout all of it with the sustaining predictability of work you love. My bungalow in Evanston, which I had kept painting and repairing and slowly making more itself during the whole period. Because there is nothing like the chaos of a family dissolution to make you want to exert your will over something small and contained. My friendship with Rachel, who had known something large was happening even before I told her, and who had provided food and company and the considerable comfort of a friend who understands that sometimes you do not want to talk about it. You just want to not be alone. And James Calloway. We had continued talking in the months after our first phone call. Carefully, incrementally, the way you build something structural when you are aware that the foundation is new and untested and deserves respect. He had told Sandra. That conversation had taken, he told me, most of an evening and a certain amount of the night, and Sandra had said things that required her to say them, and then she had been quiet for a while, and then she had asked to see a photograph of me, which James had admitted he had looked up online through my architecture firm's website. Sandra had looked at the photograph and said, "Well, she has your shoulders," and then they had sat with that for a while, and eventually she had said, "I think we should meet her." I met James in July. We met at a restaurant in Evanston near the lake, one of those summer evenings where the light off the water goes gold around 7 o'clock, and everything looks like it was composed. He was larger in person than the photograph had suggested, and he had a way of moving through a doorway and into a room that was very familiar to me in a way I did not want to examine too closely yet. He was wearing a dark blue shirt. Sandra was not there that first time. We had agreed, both of us, that the first meeting should be simpler than that. We sat across from each other, and for the first several minutes I think neither of us was entirely sure what register we were operating in. He asked about my work, and I told him about the current project I was on, a residential addition in Wilmette for a family who had 3 children, and a very specific vision, and the patience to wait for the right version of it. He told me about a project of his own, a stormwater management system for a park district in the northwest suburbs, and I asked him about the engineering decisions involved. And he answered with the attention of someone who takes questions seriously, and gradually the strangeness of the situation receded slightly behind the ordinary pleasure of 2 people who were interested in the same kinds of things talking about work. About an hour in, he set down his glass and looked at me. He said, "Your mother was one of the most genuinely intelligent people I have ever known." He said it quietly, not sentimentally. As a statement of fact, he said she read everything, and she thought carefully about all of it, and she had opinions that were not anyone else's opinions. They were entirely her own. And that was rare, he said. That was rarer than people realized. I said, "I know." He said he was sorry about the years. Not his years, not my years specifically, but the simple quantity of time that had passed without the knowledge of each other that we now had. I said I was sorry too, and I meant it in the same broad way he had meant it, not as an assignment of blame, but as the acknowledgement that a loss had occurred, and that the loss was real, even if it had been invisible. After dinner we walked along the lakeshore path for a while. The evening had gone cooler, and the light had shifted from gold to gray, and the lake was very still in the particular way it gets on certain summer evenings. We did not say much. There did not seem to be much that needed to be said in that moment. It was enough to be walking in the same direction. In September, Garrett called me. He had not reached out since the day the mediation ended. I saw his name on my phone and I considered for a moment what I wanted to do with it, and then I answered. He said, "I know I owe you more than a phone call." I said, "Garrett," he stopped. I said, "Yes, you do," he said. "Can I take you to lunch?" We had lunch at a diner near the metro station, a place we had both gone to as kids when our mother brought us downtown on Saturdays. He looked older than he had at the mediation, not in years but in some other way, as though something he had been braced against had been removed, and the removal had not made him lighter the way he had expected. He had coffee. I had coffee. We did not begin with what needed to be said. We began because we are who we are with the ordinary things, his daughters, my work, the house on Green Bay Road where our mother had lived, and which was now someone else's. Then he said, "I knew." He said it the way you say a thing you have been waiting to say for a long time, with a heaviness that comes from the waiting more than from the thing itself. He had known since he was 33. He had been going through our parents, things after our father's death, helping our mother organize the house, and he had found a letter our mother had written and then never sent, a letter to James Calloway from the year I was born. He had read it and he had put it back, and he had not said a word. Not to our mother, not to me. He had carried it for 8 years in the silence that was already the primary characteristic of our relationship, and he had told himself it was not his to share. I said, "It was mine." He said, "Yes." He looked at his coffee. He said he knew that now. He said he had told himself a great many things over 8 years that had made it easier not to say it, and that he could see clearly now that those things had been about his own comfort more than about what was right. I looked at my brother across the table in that diner, the brother who had known something that belonged to me and had held it for 8 years in a silence that had widened the already existing distance between us into something that had felt, from my side, like indifference or even dislike, but had been, apparently, something heavier and more complicated than either. I thought about whether I was angry. I found that I was. A little, but not in a way that required ventilation. The anger was there, a low, steady note beneath everything else. But what was louder than the anger was something that felt surprisingly like relief. The relief of finally understanding why the distance had always been there. The relief of a thing that had been mysterious becoming explicable. I said, "Garrett, I needed you to tell me." He said, "I know." I said, "Do you understand what that year cost me? Not the estate. I mean the year of not knowing who I was," he said. "I do." He said it quietly and I believed him. I did not tell him it was all right. It was not entirely all right, and I did not think either of us would be served by saying so. But I told him that I was glad he had called, and I told him that I wanted, if he was willing, to try to have the kind of relationship we had never managed to have before. Not because of the letter or the mediation, or any of what the past year had been, but because we were still family, whatever the biology said, and because the alternative was the continuation of a distance that had never actually been about disliking each other. It had been about one person's 8-year secret, and the weight it placed on every encounter. The secret was gone now. "We could try to see what we actually were without it," he said. "I would like that. We are careful with each other still. Careful in the way of people who are building something that should have been built a long time ago, and are therefore aware at every step of how recently the ground was cleared." His daughters came to a dinner I cooked in October, and the older one, who is 12, asked me very directly what kind of buildings I designed, and then proceeded to ask follow-up questions for 40 minutes without any apparent awareness that this might be unusual behavior. And I thought, for the first time in years, that I was glad to be in the same family as this child. James and I have met 4 times now. Sandra came to the second meeting, and we sat together in their living room in Skokie for an afternoon, and Sandra made very good tea and asked me questions about Evanston that suggested she had been thinking carefully about who I was before she met me, and had decided that I was worth knowing, which I found moving in a way I did not fully anticipate. Their daughter Kate called me on a Thursday in November, out of nowhere, to say that her father had told her about me and that she hoped we could meet sometime. I said I hoped so too. There is a word for what Kate and Michael are to me. The word is half-sibling, but I have not fully inhabited it yet. It is a new room. I am standing in the doorway. I have thought a great deal, in the year since my mother's funeral, about what it means to discover that the structure of your life is different from the one you understood yourself to be living inside. The information changes things. Of course it changes things. You learn something, and then you are a person who knows that thing, and there is no version of you that is also still the person who did not know it. But I have come to understand, slowly and not without resistance, that the change is not primarily subtraction. It feels like subtraction at first. You lose the story you had. You lose the certainty of certain foundational facts. You lose, in some measure, the father you thought you had, because even though Robert Marsh loved me and raised me and was as present as he knew how to be, the specific texture of that relationship changes when you understand it was constructed in part on a silence he was never given the choice to enter into. I grieve that. I will probably always grieve it. But what I gained is also real, and also mine. I gained the truth of who I am, which is not a small thing. I gained James Calloway, who is a serious and thoughtful man with broad shoulders and a direct way of looking at things and 40 years of work in the infrastructure of the city where I live, and who wanted to know me the moment he understood I existed. I gained the knowledge that my mother loved me deliberately and specifically, that the letter she wrote was not a deathbed confession, but a final act of care, her last effort to make sure I had what I needed to know to understand my own life. I gained a brother I am cautiously, slowly, actually beginning to know. I gained a clarity about myself and my history that I did not have a year ago and that I would not trade, despite everything it cost, for the easier version of the story I used to carry. My mother planted things she expected to be useful after she was gone. I understand that now in a way I did not before. The garden she kept, the roses along the back fence, the methodical beds, the perennials she divided and replanted every few years, because she understood that things need to be tended in order to continue, and the letter sealed and given to Helen for safekeeping, arriving in my hand on the right day in a church basement under yellow light. She knew I would need it. She built me a route to myself and she trusted me to take it. I am taking it. I am still taking it. Some roads you walk a little at a time. in the particular light of whatever season you find yourself in, paying attention to where you are putting your feet, learning the ground as you go. I have stopped being in a hurry to reach the end of it. I am not sure there is an end to reach. I think that might be the point. There is a DNA testing kit sitting on my kitchen counter. I bought it in October. At the same time I bought the paint for the bedroom, I finally decided to repaint. It is still in its box. I have not sent it yet. I know what it will confirm, and I know it will confirm it. And I find that I am in no rush to have the science put its signature on something my own body already told me when I stood in a restaurant in July and looked at a man with broad shoulders and gray hair and the habit of meeting things directly, and understood with the certainty that required no laboratory to produce that I was looking at someone I came from. I will send it eventually. I am fairly sure of that. But for now I leave it on the counter where I can see it, and when I walk past it in the mornings on my way to make coffee, it reminds me that I now live in a life where the true version of things is available to me. That is not a given. I know now, more than I did a year ago, that the true version of things can be held back by people who believe the concealment serves a purpose, or who are afraid of what the truth will ask of them, or who simply decide that someone else's need to know is less important than their own need not to say. My mother held it back for 38 years, and I believe she did it from love, and I also believe she was wrong to do it. And I hold both of those things at the same time without needing to resolve them into a single verdict, because that is what it means to love someone completely, including the ways they failed you. What I want to say, at the end of all of this, is something simple that I could not have said a year ago because a year ago I did not know it yet. You can survive not knowing who you are. You can build a life in the absence of the complete picture. You can go to work and love your friends and design buildings and plant things in your garden, and drive your 12-minute commute, and be in all the ways that are visible to the world, entirely functional and occasionally even content. But surviving without knowledge is not the same as living with it. And when the knowledge finally came to me, when it arrived in an envelope in a church basement in November, under yellow lights on a gray concrete day, what I felt under the shock and the grief and the disorientation was something I did not expect to feel. I felt relief. The deep, cellular relief of a person who has been carrying a question they did not know they were carrying, and has finally, after a very long time, been given permission to set it down. I set it down. I am still setting it down, a little at a time, in the particular light of whatever season I find myself in. The questions are still there, some of them. The grief is still there, but I am finally walking in the right direction. On ground I can see clearly toward the people who are actually mine. That is not nothing. That is, it turns out, quite a lot. The DNA kit is still on the counter. I walked past it this morning at 6:45. The early winter light coming through the kitchen window at the low, sideways angle that November produces. The lake a few blocks away doing whatever the lake does in November, which is to become enormous and gray and completely indifferent to whatever any of us are managing on shore. I made my coffee. I stood at the window for a few minutes looking at the street, the bare trees, the yellow light coming on in the house across from mine where an older man I have nodded to for 5 years lives alone, and keeps good hours. In 3 weeks I am having dinner with James and Sandra and Kate. Michael will not be there this time. He is in Denver for work. But he sent me a message last week with a question about a drainage project in Evanston he had read about and wanted to know if I had any professional connection to it, which I did, and we exchanged 4 messages about stormwater management in urban residential corridors that were the best messages I received all week. This is what it is so far. Questions about engineering, dinner plans. The very early scaffolding of something that does not yet have a name because it is too new to have settled into any of the names available to it. I called Rachel last night and told her about the dinner. Rachel said, "Are you nervous?" I said. "A little," she said. "That is healthy." She said, "You have been through a year that would have broken most people into smaller pieces, and instead you are going to dinner." I said, "I was not sure I deserved that much credit for it." She said, "You are going to take the credit because I am telling you to take it and because it is accurate." I said, "Fine," she said. "Good." And we talked about something else for a while, and then she said good night, and I made tea and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the specific quiet of a Tuesday evening, which is a quiet I have always liked. Robert Marsh taught me to drive in a parking lot on Sunday mornings. He came to my graduation and stood very straight, and did not say much but was present with his whole body in a way that I understood. He died at 61 before I knew enough about who I was to ask him certain questions I now wish I had asked. Which is the specific grief of losing someone before you know what you would have wanted to say to them. I will carry that. I will carry him. He was my father in every way that a father is made of ordinary days, and ordinary days are not nothing. They are the material of which a life is entirely composed. And James Calloway answered the phone on a Thursday evening and said, "Is this Lauren Marsh?" and then sat with me on the line for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and told me about my mother as a young woman in winter in Evanston, warm and curious and occasionally overwhelmed, and said at the end of the call that he was not going to pretend the conversation had not happened. He said he would wait. He has waited. He is still here. I am 39 years old now. I live in a 1940s brick bungalow 2 blocks from the metro station in Evanston, 12 minutes from the house where I grew up, which is either convenient or insufficiently adventurous. I am an architect. My work is still the most reliable source of satisfaction in my professional life, and I have stopped being embarrassed to say so directly. My brother and I are having dinner next month, and I am going to cook, which is an activity I have always found clarifying. The way following a specific sequence of deliberate steps toward a result you can taste tends to be clarifying when the rest of your life is still in the process of rearranging itself into a recognizable shape. The envelope my mother wrote is in the wooden box where I keep documents that matter. The DNA kit is on the kitchen counter. The winter light comes through the window at 6:45 at a low sideways angle. And the lake a few blocks away is enormous and gray and does not need anything from any of us. I am fine. I am more than fine. I am, for the first time in a long time, completely and accurately and verifiably myself.